Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground Podcast. I am your host, Joe Kuzma. I am joined once again by my co-pilot, my colleague. I would call him Robin the Batman. He's more like Nightwing in his own little superhero world over there. Mr. Steelers Grind, Eric Herman. That's Herrmann. I'm finally going to spell it right. Eric
Hi,
H.
Look at you.
How you doing, man?
Oh, any day my name spelled correctly is a great day. So
I know. I remember I screwed it up so many times. I've always felt so bad. And then you sent me a text with your name badge. It was incorrect on that too, wasn't it?
oh yeah, I'm used to it. No one spells my name right. It'll be like, oh, it's 2 R's, 2 N's. Oh, is this spelled right? Oh no, you only have 1 N. Oh, is this spelled right? Only 1 R. So it's just, I'm used to it. No offense taken.
It was great because you sent me the name badge and I said, oh, I had already had it wrong, but I had it wrong like the other way. And then so I flipped it to what the name badge said, and I didn't realize you were showing me that was wrong too. So it's like, it's just a comedy of errors. In fact, we went so long on the last show, we are back talking about Pittsburgh Steelers that you could take in your fantasy football draft. And I know some people have a love-hate relationship with fantasy football, so despite record numbers on SteelCityUnderground.com and record listens to the podcast here, which we truly greatly appreciate everyone's support, we're going to talk about fantasy football. So hopefully you don't tune out, because even if you don't follow fantasy football, we have a lot of reality football added to this, and it's really the reality football that makes the fantasy possible. So please stick with us here, because we're going to be talking about a handful of Pittsburgh Steelers here and whether or not they're going to be, well, even major contributors as far as the regular Steelers team, but more or less viable for your fantasy team. Makes me think of the movie Step Brothers. I think they asked John C. Reilly, oh, I heard you manage a team, a little league, and he's like, fantasy league. So that's where we're at. I know there's a few people out there, Ben Anderson, that's going to call me a loser because I love fantasy football. I've been playing fantasy football, I think, since I was like an 8th grader. It's well over 20 years ago. We used to get the statistics out of the newspaper because we didn't even have the internet yet. We had Apple.
Old,
yeah, I know, man. I'm 1 foot in the grave. We had the floppy disk computers with the Apple IIs, and we were playing Number Cruncher or one of the Math Blaster or whatever it was called. This thing moved around on the screen. It was educational crap. I mean, that's what you get when you rip off the box tops back in the day. So, top of the list, Eric, you got a wild guess who's at the top of my fantasy list here?
I don't know. Is it Darius Hayward-Bay?
No. He's on the list somewhere. Not quite that high.
My second guess is probably Antonio Brown.
That's a very good second guess. I'm glad we didn't have to go to 3, but I think he's the headliner of any fantasy list. You know, I remember the first time Antonio Brown was taken in one of these fantasy drafts. I think it was the same year that I actually got Jimmy Graham, like in the 7th or 8th round, and he blew up on the scene because nobody had realized how many targets were made. That was back when Jeremy Shockey just left the Saints. They didn't realize just how many. They had like 2 or 3 tight ends, and they used the crap out of the tight end position there. Antonio Brown was just breaking out on the preseason, and it was like I had a few good years there where I could always get Antonio Brown on my team. Last year made it a little more difficult, but I ended up Antonio Brown had won me a lot of money. You know how much I love AB. Business is always booming. If you're drafting and you're at the top of your draft, there is no reason to not take Antonio Brown at number 1. I don't care what format you're in. If you're in a standard or if you're in PPR, for you non-fantasy players, that is points per reception. So there's some leagues that they only give you points. It depends on the scoring. You got your friends that are commissioners, or you're in something more formal. Everyone sets up these leagues different, and there's a different amount of players that you can have. There's a different amount of teams you can have in a league. You can play in a league with maybe 8 teams, 10 teams. I'm in a 14-team league. Got the number 1 pick. Oh, it's crazy. 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, a tight end, a flex, and then, of course, a QB, defense, and a kicker. And that one goes deep, man. There's only 5 bench spots too, so you got to release players in order to fill your bye weeks. And I think I'm just going to take a goose egg. I think week 8 or week 9. I think almost half or three quarters of my teams on a bye they almost did the opposite of where people avoid bye weeks. I took them all at once, and I just said I'm not releasing anybody off my team. But I got AB number 1. I am very happy. Who does it better than Antonio Brown, Eric? I mean, this is the guy that everybody should want, right?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, regardless of your PPR standard, I remember. I don't know if he still has a streak or not, but AB had a streak of like 30-something games, 5 receptions, 50 yards a game. He had a streak of 5 receptions, 70 yards a game, and that's amazing in fantasy. That's a floor of 10 to 12 points a game if you're PPR. So Brown's just a model of consistency, and unless you have Michael Vick thrown to him, he's going to be great.
That's when that actual streak broke, was one of the Michael Vick games. It might have been the Ravens game, actually. It was one of the two, the Chargers or the Ravens game. And then, of course, he came back. He even had a solid game with Landry Jones, and had some solid production even with Landry. So Antonio Brown, consistent enough, still scores touchdowns, maybe not as many as Gronk or Des Bryant. He's going to get you the yards. If you're in a PPR format, I mean, forget about it. He's catching more balls than practically anyone. He's had the last few years like the 2nd most and the 4th most receptions in NFL history. And then I think Julio had the 2nd most in yards last season, and Antonio was right behind him with the 3rd or 4th most. And those are in NFL history. So, and let me tell you, I trust Big Ben a lot more than I do Matt Ryan or anybody that's on the Atlanta Falcons for that matter. We are talking about Steelers you want to draft. The next guy I want to take is Lev Bell. What do you think about Lev Bell? He's going to miss 3 games anyway. I don't think it's much of a big deal. He was killing it last year, even though he was in the top 5 scoring like in 8 weeks, and he only played 6 weeks. It's pretty crazy. So definitely one of these guys that you want to have on the roster. And even though he's suspended, I don't think health is a major concern. It's been mostly dirty hits. I really despise a lot of people saying his injury history, because what are you going to do when a 250-pound bullet comes at you helmet first into your knee? Not much you could do there. So does that irk you too when people talk about Le'Veon Bell and injuries? I mean, it's just, they act like he's not a consistent player. I don't really think it's been his fault either time. Do you?
Yeah, it's like Pouncey. It's not his fault. Players just keep rolling onto his ankle, and in Le'Veon Bell's case, it's not his fault that dirty players keep trying to target and hurt him. Like, what can you do about that? But it does help that if you watched the game on last Friday, you did notice he kind of went out of bounds a little bit more often instead of fighting for those extra yards every play. So that does give a little bit of encouragement that he does have more of his health in mind. So I think health-wise, he's not a concern, but the suspension, I think that's a little bit of a reason for concern, because I think it almost depends on your league. Like, I know my first fantasy league I've done was a 10-person league, and my running back depth is really good because on my bench I just have Melvin Gordon, Jeremy Langford, Jeremy Hill. And in that kind of league, I could easily afford to have Le'Veon Bell because I have guys who could fill in his place. But in 14 teams like you guys have, like, running back depth can be really sparse. So not having a good running back for 3 weeks, like 3 losses in fantasy, that can easily cost you playoffs. So that just makes it a lot bigger risk.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. It's something that was a consideration. I actually have 2 players that are currently serving suspension. I'm going to get to that at the tail end of this discussion because they're non-Steelers. I'm going to be talking. Had the article over at steelcityunderground.com and also at behindthesteelcurtain.com as well, syndicated there, where it's talking about, is fantasy football good for football? It's one of the more lengthy reads. It's something that most people, if you haven't checked it out yet, head on over to one of those 2 websites and read, because I compared the whole fantasy football phenomena to what happened with online poker several years ago. Really, really, really hit it off with several people who happened to be poker players there too. One guy actually said this was excellent. He was not to pat my own back or give myself a high five, but it was from my heart. I had a real passion for it, and I hate that they were trying to shut down like the daily fantasy and the regular fantasy football games. They were successful with this with poker, but I don't think poker is anywhere near, even though it hit a real wave of popularity, anywhere near how popular the NFL is. And if you read that article, I give a lot of reasoning for how fantasy football has helped the popularity of the NFL, because we're going to be talking about some people probably at the tail end of this when we talk about some non-Steelers that otherwise, why would you care? Why would you ever watch the game? I mean, I remember you throw on Monday Night Football. I was younger. You might open up like a pop or a soda for those of you who aren't in this part of the country, and maybe a bag of chips, and you're watching. It's like the Bears and Bears and Lions maybe. Who cares? Do I really want to watch these two teams, or even in the NFC? I mean, I don't even have a vested interest if one of them loses because they don't play in my division or in my in the conference. Of course, mine is though I own the Steelers. So talking fantasy football as though these are all my players. But getting back to Le'Veon Bell in the whole fantasy football thing, check out the articles. So Le'Veon Bell, 13th ranked player overall, according to consensus ADP, which is your average draft position. So if that's a 12-team league, it's going to snake back around the round 2 and he's gone. If you're in a little bit shorter of a league, maybe just 10 teams, 8 teams, good chance you could get him in the second round. I think he's a good value there. I'm not the ultimate fantasy football expert. I do okay. My wife actually does great. You want to talk about why fantasy football is great for football? That's it right there. Name any offensive player practically, aside from some rookies. And this is somebody that probably, if you named, like, let's say I just said Chargers, and you're playing a game and I say Chargers, and you would have to guess the city. And that's what I used to do. I mean, she didn't pay attention to football all that much, other than, of course, we know she's a Cleveland Browns fan, and she knew a few players on there, but didn't know their whole team. Are you kidding me right now? She is capable of drafting doing a 16-round draft, 10 teams, and we actually co-own the one team I just did in this 14-team league, and we argue over who we're going to take. That's the impact of fantasy football right there. My wife wouldn't give it. Now, if you talk about somebody like, I don't know, just throw out a Steeler like Lawrence Timmons, because she probably knows James Harrison. I mean, the more popular guys, J.J. Watt. Oh, of course. Jeez, I'm glad J.J.'s not around. I'd have to fight him. She loves J.J. Watt, and she's not even a Texans fan, but that's kind of like if you have another team or whatever. But anyways, J.J. Watt, she would know. But if you throw out like, what did I say on the last one? I was talking about Johnny Simon going with another Texan there, and he had the pick 6 on Carson Palmer. She would have no clue who that is. She would just know, I have the Texans defense, and they scored a touchdown, and I'm like real excited. And Carson Palmer threw that pick, and he's playing for the other team, and they just lost 2 points, and she would be excited about it. So that's why fantasy football is great for football. So, Lev Bell, Antonio Brown, getting back on the track with the Steelers you should have on your fantasy team. There aren't, well, I have a couple more, but you probably know who the next name is.
I'm guessing Ben Roethlisberger.
Absolutely.
See, Ben is tricky because I know a big narrative for him has been, can he stay healthy? But many forget, I think it was just last season, 2015, he played all 16 games as far as I know. So I kind of like with Le'Veon Bell, his getting hurt is also players trying to hit him hard, injure him. And I know that's not the entire case, but I think his injuries are kind of overstated because he does have a really good offensive line now. I know the left tackle situation was kind of tricky last year, but should be improved. So I would say Ben's worth drafting. I know some leagues, like the league I'm in, they always overdraft quarterbacks, like players like Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers will always go in the top 2 rounds. So it's kind of tricky. It almost depends on your league, how much you value your quarterbacks. Me personally, I usually wait for the guys to fall. Like on my roster, I'm carrying 3 guys. I have Tyrod Taylor, Matt Stafford, and Eli, just hoping one of them turns out. But if you play in a league with smart people who don't just overvalue quarterbacks like crazy, Ben definitely is a guy worth considering if you can be had at the right price, because with that offense, like I think that same 16-game season, he almost threw for 5,000 yards. He missed it by, I'm pretty sure, just a couple. Yeah. So if Ben can stay healthy, which he should be able to, he has Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell most of the season. He'll definitely produce for you.
Yeah, that's exactly where I am. And you mentioned another underappreciated guy, Eli Manning, who turned it around some last year. The thing is with actually, I usually call the New York Giants maybe not recently, but they had always been a model franchise, much like the Steelers, and a lot of parallels there as far as a multiple Super Bowl winning quarterback that came out of the same year in that same draft, and mostly underappreciated when you talk about the league's best. The year you were talking about with Ben was maybe 2014, not 2015, where they just smashed all the records across. That was AB, Bell, and Ben, the Killer Bees, had them all on the field for all 16 games. In fact, interesting enough with Roethlisberger, and I was talking about this with Todd Haley and Todd Haley's system, and you got the people that still say, hashtag fire Haley, and just I roll my eyes at that.
I throw it out there for fun sometimes, just goes.
And it's just one of those things where with Haley's system, Ben has actually, I think he's missed 7 total games. It doesn't include, I think, portions of games. I think that's just full games. And when you look at over the same 4-year period, Aaron Rodgers has also missed 7 games. And most of that was with the collarbone in the one season. Ben's has been broken up. It was the first year that Haley was here. I think he had the high ankle sprain that year. And then, of course, last season. But for the most part, the 2 that are sandwiched in between, that's why you never saw like Bruce Gradkowski ever on the field. He played all 16 both of those seasons. So I think that fear is just because Ben plays a more rough and tumble style than Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers is just going to throw the ball away. And I think he gets a bad rap for that. But the other thing that might frustrate you with Ben is that he does have Le'Veon Bell. He does have D'Angelo Williams back there. So if they run and pound the football, Ben may only he might throw for no touchdowns. He might throw for 1, might throw for 2. So whereas Aaron Rodgers, and they've tried this, they tried with Eddie Lacy, and it just hasn't been working out. I remember Eddie Lacy was one of the higher ranked running backs last year, and that guy is just, nobody wants to touch him with a 40-foot pole now. Big Ben, ADP of 53, so average draft position 53 overall, and a QB 6. Interesting enough. So they think there's 5 quarterbacks better than Ben Roethlisberger. I think if you're going to get Ben in the mid to later rounds, when everybody else is, like you said, already jumped on somebody like Andrew Luck, who I don't know that I would want to touch personally, or Aaron Rodgers. Okay, I could understand Aaron Rodgers there. Fine. They're going to jump on them. You may reap the rewards by getting Big Ben later, and they're going to call you a homer because you're a Steelers fan and you're taking your guy, but we all know how good he is and how disrespected he pretty much is, and he doesn't say anything about it, just goes about doing his business, just like this other gentleman I'm going to mention. Chris Boswell is a very good draft choice, although I don't want to take kickers until I'm almost done with my draft, but if you happen to land upon this guy, anything short of 40, he was a perfect 18 for 18. He was 9 of 12 between 40 and 49, and 2 for 2 from 50 plus, although that was 50 yards and a 51-yarder, so 51 being his long last year. Also 7 and 7 in 2 playoff games, including that intense finish in Cincinnati. Guy is cool as ice, replaces Sean Sweesham, who was always a consistent kicker. While I don't want to overvalue kickers in any fantasy draft, I think if Chris Boswell is available for you, it's another Steeler, another homer pick that you may want to make, because even New England, Stephen Gostkowski, in a fairly decent scoring offense, has a lot of opportunities and has been one of the NFL's league leaders in scoring over several years, almost the entire time since he's taken over for Adam Vinatieri, who used to lead before that. Any thoughts on kickers or the Wizard of Boz, Eric?
I do love Boswell, but kind of like the reason you were saying how the Steelers are going to go for a lot of 2-point conversions, that does make them a little bit risky, but the meat of fantasy points for kickers does come from the field goals. PATs give you 1 point. And sometimes that can make or break a game, but it doesn't happen very often. So I feel safe with Boswell. And I know kickers, a lot of it's just situation rather than talent. Like, depending on the teams, they have a good offense, a bad offense, how good are they in red zone efficiency. Like, kickers are really tough. You just kind of got to go based on prior year rankings and just hope the players don't choke or get bad. But I think if you're getting a kicker, I think Boswell's a pretty good choice.
So another name heading down the list here, and this is almost going to wrap up the guys that have any major value to your fantasy team. We talked earlier about the flip side of Le'Veon Bell missing 3 games due to suspension. This is where D'Angelo Williams fills in. This is the exact opposite. If you need somebody for 3 games, and you could do what's called a handcuff for you non-fantasy players or anyone new to playing fantasy games. A handcuff basically means you pick up the backup running back to your stud running back that would be your normal starter should they get hurt. So for this example, obviously Le'Veon Bell would be handcuffed to D'Angelo Williams. If you get the visual there, that's why it's called a handcuff. So D'Angelo had a heck of a season last year, 907 yards receiving, 11 rushing touchdowns. He had career highs in receptions and receiving yards. He could duplicate a lot of that performance, but a lot of that would be dictated as to whether or not he actually gets on the field. We know he's good for 3 games. Is this somebody that you would target normally, Eric? I mean, myself, 14-team league, I know somebody that doesn't have him handcuffed, and it just seems really awkward because, to me, I didn't see D'Angelo enough on the field when Lev Bell was on the field last season.
CJ, I personally don't think I touched D'Angelo Williams, and that's not an insult on him at all. It's just his role is the backup, and kind of like you said, when Le'Veon Bell was going full steam ahead, we barely saw him. And that may change a little bit this year, saying they want to preserve Bell's health a little bit, so they may give more balls to D'Angelo, but that still doesn't justify his draft position because in my draft, I know he was going pretty high. He was going around the level of starters like Jeremy Langford. And even though it is true he will be starting those 3 games, I just don't think that's enough to just take him just for those 3 games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something where you put an asterisk next to his name. If you happen to have Le'Veon Bell and you could grab Williams later in your draft, it's somebody you might want to stash away on the bench. We talked about all the hyperbole of Bell's injury history and it just being bad luck. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I was thinking it when you mentioned Marquise Pouncey. That's the name I always throw out, whereas people don't ever give him any flack over his injury history, but a lot of people tend to think Lev Bell has a lot of injury history. And Marquise Pouncey is a very highly paid player, one of the highest paid at his position, and I think he had the richest contract for a center when he was originally awarded that new contract too. But yet Le'Veon Bell wraps about, 12 mil, 13 mil, 16 million, whatever it was, and everybody loses their minds, and it's just it's just one of those things where, you know what, Le'Veon Bell, I think he's good to go. I mean, he's missed at least 3 games in his first 3 seasons here. He was hurt coming into the Steelers as a rookie. He did play all the games. Actually, did I say he missed all 3? I'm trying to think now if he missed anything in the middle. Maybe he didn't. But of course, he did get hurt before the playoffs in that middle year. And then last year being suspended and then getting hurt following that. Just really bad luck. The guy's snake bitten. If you want Williams, put an asterisk next to Williams, especially take him if you happen to have Le'Veon Bell. Marcus Wheaton, another wide receiver. A lot of people are really high on drafting this guy. That's because he finished really strong last season in his last 6 games. But everything before that, the previous 10 games, this isn't a guy anybody even wanted on their roster. So he would end the season with 4 of his 5 touchdowns in those final 6 games, and the whole lot of his production was a 9-catch, 201-yard, 1-touchdown game against the Seattle Seahawks because, well, let's face it, even Legion of Boom didn't have enough defenders to cover all the weapons the Steelers had. Steelers now without Martavis Bryant, a lot of people think that Marcus Wheaton's going to step up and get a lot of that production. but I don't know that I'm necessarily willing to lean in that same direction as some of those people think. We use some terms in fantasy football, such as like a wide receiver 3, meaning if you happen to start 3 wide receivers, could be somebody in that option, or the flex, meaning, well, the flex position is you could play a running back, a wide receiver, and in some leagues, even a tight end. One of those 3 positions in that, it's kind of like your wild card or joker type fantasy play. And you could put anybody in there. If you're in a deep enough league, maybe you're looking at Marcus Wheaton like that. I don't know that his ceiling will ever be as high as a wide receiver 2 or a wide receiver 1 as somebody like Antonio Brown, because even Martavis Bryant really wasn't in that territory last year.
Yeah, Wheaton's a guy I don't have a lot of confidence being a fantasy stud. I think his value comes almost as a sleeper because, as far as I know, he's not that well known around the league. So I think a lot of people don't realize he is the number 2 receiver in this offense. And I'm pretty sure he's going late in a lot of drafts. Like, if you do draft Wheaton, it's not going to cost you a high draft pick, or you're not going to really lose someone big when you take Wheaton. So I do think Wheaton's worth taking just because he has a lot of potential to put up big numbers in this offense. And we've seen guys like Emmanuel Sanders just out of the blue produce a huge season. Like, that could be Wheaton this year for all we know.
Yeah, and if it isn't, I mean, they have him ranked here as the 46th wide receiver as far as ADP, the 46th best. That means even if you have 3 wide receivers on every roster in a 12-team league, that's only 36 receivers. You could still go 10 more deep. The guy shouldn't cost you hardly anything more than even a waiver wire pickup if he's sitting around out there. Being Steelers fans, we know his value to the team. That is to our advantage. Might be somebody to stash away. Wouldn't expect a whole lot to happen. There's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. One of those could be tight end Ladarius Green if he ever gets on the field. In San Diego, Green, who won me a lot of money actually in DraftKings, subbing in for a then suspended Antonio Gates. He was sitting out. That one was a performance-enhancing drug suspension. We were talking about that before. That one most certainly was, and Gates sat out 4 games to start the 2015 season. Ladarius Green filled in there very nicely, had a good stat line, and he actually played over 60% of his snaps out of the slot position when he was with the Chargers last year. So if that were to continue in Pittsburgh and he's in the slot, if he gets on the field, of course, he could easily be the guy instead of Marcus Wheaton that's making up for the Martavis Bryant production. But the 50-60 catches that Martavis Bryant and also Heath Miller, you're looking at 120 to 120. That's just the catches. Those are the catches. Those aren't even the targets, how highly targeted Martavis Bryant was. There's going to be a lot of targets to go around. Ladarius Green could eat into those, but I don't know if he's draftable at this point. He will be out at least 6 weeks to start the season. So keep that in mind that if you draft Ladarius Green, he will not be playing for the first 6 games of the season if he were to play at all. But I don't know what you do. If you're in a deep league, maybe keep an eye out. So we talked about all the receivers. We talked about all the running backs. We talked about the main quarterback, because hopefully we don't meet anyone besides Big Ben, especially you're talking about fantasy. I'm talking about reality. Let's just leave it with Ben playing all 16 games, like we said, a very durable guy. And let's talk about the other side of the football. Now, I'm not going to talk about individual player drafts or IDP leagues. We're just going to talk about a whole. With the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, I really like the Steelers defense. I think I made a mistake and passed on them, Eric. But do you think that would be wise for most people to do? It's very hard for me to take a defense anywhere in these drafts because very seldom do they live up to their billing on paper.
Yeah, I think the defense, it's always tricky with fantasy defense because very rarely does the number 1 projected defense actually finish number 1. But there is definitely some value with the Steelers because I know most players that aren't Steelers fans will kind of dismiss them based on, oh, they were 30th in passing and, oh, they suck. But the Steelers were almost leaders in sacks, turnovers, and that's what gets you the money in fantasy for defense. Like when you produce sacks and turnovers and interceptions like the Steelers do, that can definitely do well. So I wouldn't necessarily draft them really high, as like some people do with the Seahawks or the Broncos. But if they fall, I would definitely pick them up.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. And even the Seahawks and Broncos, it's very hard taking one of them. Like some people pull the trigger when you could get, like we're talking about some of the players that could be a sleeper, like a Marcus Wheaton. I'd much rather put a Marcus Wheaton, stash him on my bench than rolling the dice and taking one of the first defenses off the board. And of course, the same thing with the kicker. So you're talking about fantasy strategy there. And part of that strategy, I have read just about everything. This aforementioned article generated a lot of comments on social media, a lot of comments on Behind the Steel Curtain over the weekend, even on SteelCityUnderground.com. I got a few comments there. Let me tell you, they're all over the board when it comes to Steelers fans. There are some Steelers fans who say there is no way in HE double hockey sticks that they will take another player for their fantasy team that happens to play for the Bengals, the Ravens, or the Browns. And then you've got some other people that are like, well, I will take a player, let's say AJ Green. We'll throw out a very good player, actually. And I'll take like an AJ Green, but I won't play him if they're playing the Steelers that week. And both of these things, I'm just kind of shaking my head there. And it's the question of the fandom. It was the question of if fantasy football is good for football. And it's very interesting to read these things because then, of course, you have the gambler who comes in and makes a very snide comment about, hey, guys, let me know what leagues you're playing in so I could play against you. Because he's ready to sweep up the AJ Greens. It's going to get the world that are going to get him the points. And I guess the general question here is, can you take a rival player in fantasy, and how does that project into the whole? Is fantasy football good for football? Do you ever find yourself rooting for? Well, let's put it this way. If you're forced to watch a Bengals game, I will say this much. I think I had Jeremy Hill last year, and he was terrible, by the way. And I'm so glad he fumbled like he had been fumbling all year, and Ryan Shazier got that ball off of him. But I never really found myself, and at least in the case of Jeremy Hill too, I didn't find myself ever rooting for the Bengals. And I never really found myself really rooting for Hill so much as I'd like to see him rip off a 15-yard run or run into the end zone, get a touchdown, and score. That was good for my fantasy team, and that's about where it stands. But I found myself yelling at the TV more about Jeremy Hill because he was just terrible last year. Terrible. What do you think? Can you take a rival player on your fantasy team? What are your thoughts on that whole process?
Yeah, see, I don't oppose it. I'm pretty sure last year I picked up Buck Allen. He did well for me. I've had AJ Green in the past. I mean, I don't root for the Bengals or the Ravens, but I mean, fantasy for me is kind of subjective, where I can put away my biases and fandom and focus on making some money. And I know definitely, like, if a team's playing the Steelers, I'll still play my player, but I won't be upset. It's almost like a win-win for me, because if the Steelers win, that's great. If my Steelers lose and my guys do well, that's also kind of nice, even though it's not as nice. I obviously want the Steelers to win. But I don't oppose it. I know back in the day when I was young and stupid, which is surprising to say since I'm also still pretty young right now.
Yesterday.
Yeah. But I know years ago, I was watching a Steeler game with my parents, and I had Demaryius Thomas, and he did well. I was like, yes, he got a touchdown. My parents were like, wait, what are you talking about? The Broncos guys scored a touchdown. It's like, oh, I have him in fantasy. Like, I don't do that anymore. I know there's some people out there, but if one of my guys is playing the Steelers, like, Steelers are first and foremost the people I'm rooting for. And if I lose, that's fine if the Steelers win. Yeah,
and you know what? It's even, let's just say it's the Bengals and the Steelers. And I think the only Bengal, in my opinion, that has – some people may argue that Andy Dalton has some draft value. I think he's terrible. I think he has a bunch of –
I'd draft Andy Dalton. I'd draft him. Because, I mean, in the playoffs he chokes, but during the regular season he's pretty good. I know it kind of hurts him that he lost Marvin Jones and Mohamed Sanu, but I'd still take him as at least a backup.
Yeah, he doesn't have any good wide receivers around him except AJ Green. They like to run the ball. There's reports that they're going to run the ball even more. You talk about a two-headed monster in Pittsburgh. They really want to jam Jeremy Hill and Giovanni Bernard down everyone's throats. And I think because of that timeshare there, and where one's used more in the passing game and one's more used in the rushing game with that split, those two guys don't have any value. Brandon LaFell, are you kidding me? I don't think Brandon LaFell is very good. You just seen he had like one decent year with New England, everything's dropped off. If you leave New England, I mean, if you don't leave New England on your own accord, it usually means that they've gotten what they want out of you, or they don't see any value in you. AJ Green, yeah, he'll do okay, but Andy Dalton's another one of those guys where he's very flaky and up and down. And I'm going to jump right over to the Baltimore Ravens here. You mentioned Buck Allen. I had him off of waiver wires because I was struggling for running backs last year. And I took him, and Forsett breaks his arm, and Forsett had an okay year the year before. He came out of like nowhere. It was I think he was the only free agent that they retained. They had like 5 major free agents, and they let like 4 of the other guys go, or something to that effect. And then you see what happened with their team. They were terrible. Joe Flacco, I don't like him at all. Don't think he's a fantasy quarterback. I don't like him as a reality quarterback. I think he has one bag of tricks that's to throw the ball downfield. That would be the Mike Wallace.
And hope for pass interference, of course.
And get a pass interference. Well, as Mike Wallace, they still can't get Brashard Perryman out there. They're trying to haul out, I think, 30. Talk about old. We were talking about a 38-year-old James Harrison, about a 37-year-old Steve Smith Sr. I don't want to call him Junior. He's definitely a senior. He's coming back from a very major injury. They're throwing everything at the dartboard here and seeing what sticks. They're doing it with the running backs, too. They have such a committee there. They drafted a guy as a Kenneth Dixon, I think. They're throwing him in the mix. They still have Javoris Allen, or Buck, as we were calling him. I think Forsett's still working his way into there. So they have like 3 guys there at the tight end position. Now, Benjamin Watson got hurt. He was kind of a out of nowhere darling with the Saints last year. They have Dennis Pitta there. They have Crockett Gilmore, who I was actually, when I was looking at this roster, and then of course Max Williams, who everyone thought that they stole from us in the draft last year. But when I was looking at this roster and we were looking at various rosters trying to see who could be a casualty, Crockett Gilmore was a guy I was hoping might get cut, because the Steelers, Mike Tomlin's not against like looking across the field and seeing guys that could help make his team better. And Crockett Gilmore had been one of those guys that was really tearing us up. And when Jordan Todman did that in the preseason last year with the Carolina Panthers, he ends up on our roster as well. And then, of course, Big Al, Alejandro Villanueva, ended up there here in much the same fashion. So Baltimore Ravens, they've got way too many guys at way too many positions. I don't think there's anyone that's draftable, and of course they had a pretty miserable team as it was. And then finally the Cleveland Browns. Yeah, there's a pause there, Eric. I don't have anything to say about the Cleveland Browns, but I will say I had somebody that was ragging on me. You saw my roster. I went with Josh Gordon. That was partially with my wife, but when you're going 14 teams deep, 4-game suspension, they're saying the guy looks the same way he used to put up wide receiver 1 numbers, and they have no one else that's there. That's pretty much it. And I kind of almost like Duke Johnson too, but I still don't know. You don't know what Cleveland is. Cleveland is, all you know is that that's a mess, and you should probably avoid it at all costs, including all their players. Some people like RG3, might be somebody you stash away on your bench, but if you're looking within your division, for the most part, from what I said, who did I say? AJ Green. That was pretty much like the only guy. Maybe a flyer on Josh Gordon, and that's that's about it.
I think Corey Coleman could be a flyer. He's apparently been good.
It's still Cleveland, though. They don't score.
Yeah,
they haven't scored. So, so when people are saying, "Oh, I don't want to take opponents within my same division," it's just like there's nobody in the same division that's really worth taking that has any fantasy value. At least not this year. Now you might go with like a team defense or a kicker, but you know what? It's not going to upset me. Who is it? Is it Justin Tucker that's with the Ravens? It's not going to upset me if he wins or loses me a game in any instance because it's a kicker. So, no, kickers are back to not being people now. So, especially if it's a Baltimore Raven. Once again, you can follow Eric Herman. That's HERRMANN That is not his Twitter handle. It is at Steelers Grind. If you want to follow Eric. Eric, thank you once again for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. It's always fun talking fantasy.
Absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, that does it for the wraps on. I wanted to say it was part 2 of the fantasy show. We actually did a little bit more news than we did fantasy on part 1. So thank you for tuning in. For those of you who aren't fantasy players, hopefully maybe you learned a thing or two. Maybe it'll turn you towards wanting to play some fantasy football. I know a lot of people are asking me to be in a lot of leagues. I'm already in a lot already, so I appreciate your invites, but I'm stretched thin as it is. Mm-hmm. But until next time, be safe, be good, and I will catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.